The ironclad came out of faster-than-light travel like a mountain breaking through the sky. It was enormous. The Rathani had seen warships before. The Kael'vor dreadnoughts that had burned their world were big, ugly, and terrifying. But the ironclad was something else entirely. It was longer than any vessel the Rathani had ever recorded. Its hull was thick gray armor plated in layers, and along every surface there were rows of weapons, railguns, missile tubes, laser arrays, and systems that the Rathani sensors could not even identify. The ship did not look like it had been built. It looked like it had been forged, like someone had taken a world's worth of metal and anger and shaped it into something that existed for one single purpose. Behind it, 3 transport ships dropped out of travel, each one the size of a Rathani cruiser, riding in the battleship's wake like children following a parent. The Rathani fleet panicked. Alarms screamed across 47 ships. Pilots fired up engines that were barely working. Mothers grabbed their children and ran for the inner compartments. On a dozen vessels, the few remaining Rathani soldiers powered up whatever weapons they had left, which was not much. War Chief Dren stormed onto the bridge of the flagship and shouted at the sensor officer to identify the incoming ships. When the officer told him it was the Terran vessel that had responded to their message, Dren did not relax. He looked at the ironclad on the display screen and said that no species answering a cry for help brought that much firepower. He said it was an invasion force. He said they should run. Sayla was already at her station. She opened the comm channel and broadcast to the entire Rathani fleet, telling them in a clear voice that these were the humans, the ones who had answered, and that they needed to hold position and not do anything foolish. On the bridge of the ironclad, Commander Danny Holt watched the Rathani fleet on his tactical display and saw the fear. Small ships were scattering. Energy signatures spiked as weapons came online. He understood immediately. These people had been hunted for months. They saw a warship, and their bodies told them to run. Holt made a decision. He ordered the ironclad to power down all visible weapon systems. The railgun turrets retracted. The missile tubes sealed. The targeting arrays went dark. Then he told his operations officer to activate the external running lights. Every single one of them. It was an old human naval tradition. A ship lit up like that was saying, "I am here, and I am not hiding, and I mean you no harm." The ironclad lit up against the black of space like a city in the dark. Then Holt opened a wideband channel that every ship in the Rathani fleet could hear. He spoke slowly and clearly. He said his name was Danny Holt, and that he was the commanding officer of the USS Ironclad, United Earth Fleet. He said his government had received the Rathani distress signal, and had sent everything it could. He said the 3 ships behind him carried food, medicine, clean water, building materials, and engineering teams. He said the ironclad itself was there for one reason, to make sure that while the humans helped the Rathani, nobody else could hurt them. He paused, and then he said something that Sayla would later tell her children about. He said, "We did not come all this way to scare you. We came because you asked for help, and where we come from, that means something." The Rathani fleet stopped scattering. The weapons powered down. The alarms fell silent, one by one. Elder Vathi, who had been listening from the council chamber, authorized a small human delegation to come aboard the flagship. Holt sent Lieutenant Karen Price to lead the group. Price was a sharp woman with dark hair pulled back tight and a way of looking at people that made them feel like she was reading their thoughts. With her went Sergeant Liam Grady, a big, solid man who rarely spoke more than he needed to, along with 4 Marines in light armor. Nora Webb came as well, carrying a datapad and a field kit, and with her was Specialist Amy Tran, a small woman with quick hands and oil stains on her uniform that she never seemed to be able to wash out completely. The shuttle docked with the Rathani flagship, and the humans stepped out into the corridor. The smell hit them first. It was the smell of a ship that had been running too long with too many people and not enough air recycling. Stale, thick, warm in a way that was not comfortable. The lights in the corridor were dim because the power systems were failing, and half the overhead panels had gone dark entirely. Then they saw the people. Rathani families lined the corridors. They were thin. Their feathers, which should have been bright and full, were dull and falling out. Children clung to their parents and stared at the humans with wide, dark eyes. An old Rathani man sat against the wall, with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and he was so still that for a moment Grady thought he was dead. Then the man blinked and looked up at them, and the look in his eyes was the kind of emptiness that comes from hoping for too long and getting nothing. Nobody on the human team spoke for a few seconds. They just looked. Dr. Webb broke first. She opened her comm channel to the Ironclad, and her voice was tight and controlled, the way a person sounds when they are very angry but do not want to show it. She requested emergency medical teams immediately. She requested portable oxygen units, water purifiers, and nutritional supplement kits. She said she needed them now, not in an hour, not when it was convenient, now. Corporal Tony Vega arrived within 40 minutes. He was a young man with steady hands and a calm face that made sick people feel like things might be all right. He carried a full trauma kit, and behind him came 4 more medics with stretchers and supply crates. They set up in the middle of the corridor and started working. The first patient was a Rathani child with a broken arm that had healed wrong because there had been no one to set it properly. Vega looked at the arm, looked at the child's mother, and said through Sayla's translation that he was going to fix it and that the child would be fine. The mother stared at him like she did not understand the words, not because of the language, but because she had forgotten what it sounded like when someone said things would be fine and meant it. While the medics worked, Lieutenant Price went to the council chamber to meet the Rathani leadership. Elder Vathi received her with what dignity he could manage. He was thin and tired, but he stood straight and greeted her formally. His voice cracked once during the greeting, and he pretended it did not happen, and Price pretended along with him. War Chief Dren stood in the corner. He did not greet her. He watched her the way a man watches a snake, waiting to see if it would bite. Price did not waste time with speeches. She told Vathi that the human convoy carried enough food to feed the entire Rathani fleet for 3 months. She told him that engineering teams were standing by to begin repairs on every ship that needed them, and that medical staff would set up treatment stations across the fleet within the day. Dren spoke. He asked her the question that had been sitting at his chest since the Ironclad appeared. He asked why. He said the Rathani had called out to 42 species, and every one of them had a reason to say no. The Kael'vor were dangerous. Getting involved was risky. There was nothing to gain. So why did the humans come? Price looked at him for a long moment. Then she said that the humans had a long and ugly history. She said her people had spent a very long time hurting each other in every way possible. Wars, slavery, cruelty, greed, every terrible thing a thinking creature could do, humans had done it to one another. She said they had nearly destroyed themselves more than once. But they had also learned something from all that suffering. They had learned what it looked like when someone was in pain, and the rest of the world turned away. And they had decided, slowly and imperfectly, and after a lot of mistakes, that they did not want to be the ones who turned away. She said that when someone was drowning, you did not stop to ask if saving them was worth the risk. You just jumped in. Dren stared at her. His jaw was tight. He said nothing for a long time. Then he gave a single nod and walked out of the room. Back in the corridors, Sergeant Grady was walking through the ship. He did not speak. He saw the patched walls, the cracked supports, the families sleeping on the floor because there were not enough rooms. He saw a Rathani boy, maybe 6 years old, sitting alone in a doorway, holding a piece of scrap metal like it was a toy. Grady stopped in front of the boy. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small ration bar. He held it out. The boy looked at him, looked at the bar, and took it with both hands. He did not eat it. He broke it in half and held one half out to Grady. Grady took it. He ate it standing in that dim corridor next to a child he could not speak to. And something in his chest shifted in a way that he would not talk about later, but would not forget either. He went back to the shuttle bay and called his squad. He told them to bring every repair kit, every toolbox, and every spare part they could carry. He told them these people had been living in a broken ship for months, and that the Marines were going to fix it tonight. Nobody asked questions. They just moved. On the ironclad, Holt stood alone on the bridge and studied the long-range sensor display. There was a contact at the very edge of detection range. It was faint, and it could have been nothing, a stray signal, a drifting asteroid, sensor noise. But it was moving, and it was heading in their direction. Holt told his sensor officer to keep watching it and to notify him the moment it resolved into something identifiable. Then he turned off the display and went to check on the supply transfer operations, because there were people who needed feeding, and he could worry about the dark later. 3 days passed, and the humans did not stop. Dr. Nora Webb had not slept more than 4 hours in any of those 3 days, and she did not plan on sleeping much in the next 3 either. She had set up a command post in the cargo bay of the lead transport ship and turned it into a planning center covered in data screens, structural diagrams of every Rathani vessel, and priority lists written in her own handwriting because she did not trust anyone else to get the order right. She divided every ship in the refugee fleet into 3 categories. Red meant the ship was in danger of failing completely and needed immediate work. Yellow meant serious problems that could wait a day or 2 but not much longer. Green meant the ship could fly and keep its people alive for now. Out of 47 Rathani vessels, 31 were red. Webb sent teams to the red ships first. Each team had 2 human engineers, 2 Marines for heavy lifting, and whatever Rathani crew members could be spared to help. They carried welding kits, hull plates, replacement wiring, oxygen scrubbers, and water recyclers pulled from the transport ships. The work was hard and ugly. The Rathani ships had been built for peace, not for running. Their hulls were thin, their systems were elegant but fragile. Months of hard travel with no proper maintenance had pushed everything past its limits. Pipes had cracked, seals had rotted. Entire sections of some ships had been sealed off because the hull breaches were too big to patch with what the Rathani had on hand. The humans patched them anyway. Specialist Amy Tran became the person everyone talked about. She was not big, she was not loud. She was a short woman with dark hair tied back in a knot, and hands that were never clean because she was always elbow-deep in some piece of broken machinery. She moved from ship to ship like a ghost with a welding torch, and everywhere she went, things that were broken started working again. On the 2nd day, she was working on a Rathani transport that carried 200 families. The main structural beam that held the ship's midsection together had a crack running through it, and if it failed, the ship would break in half. The Rathani engineers had been reinforcing it with scrap metal and adhesive for weeks, but the crack was growing. Tran looked at the beam for 10 minutes without speaking. Then she went back to the transport ship, cut 3 heavy cargo braces out of a storage container, brought them back, and spent 14 hours welding them into a reinforcement frame around the cracked beam. She did not take a break. When a Rathani engineer offered her food, she ate it with one hand while welding with the other. When she was done, the beam was stronger than it had been when the ship was new. The Rathani engineer, who had been watching her work, asked her, through Selah, why she had done all of this for people she did not know. Tran looked at him and said it was Tuesday. The engineer did not understand what that meant. Tran did not explain. She picked up her tools and moved to the next ship. On the military side, Sergeant Liam Grady had set up a security perimeter around the entire fleet. The Ironclad's drone network, small unmanned sensor platforms that could spread out across a wide area, gave them eyes in every direction. Grady ran patrol schedules, set up watch rotations, and made sure that if anything came at them from the dark, they would see it coming. But Grady did more than stand guard. In his off hours, and there were not many of them, he helped distribute food on the Rethani ships. The supply crates from the transports were heavy, and the Rethani corridors were narrow and not designed for carrying large loads. Grady and his Marines hauled the crates by hand, moving through ship after ship until every family had been fed. The Rethani children followed the Marines everywhere. They were fascinated by the humans, by their size, their strange flat faces, their loud boots on the metal floors. Most of the Marines handled this with awkward kindness, handing out ration bars and trying to communicate with hand gestures and smiles. Grady was not a man who smiled easily. His face looked like it had been set in a permanent expression of serious thought. But on the third day, a small Rethani child, a girl with pale feathers and enormous dark eyes, walked up to him in a corridor, tugged on his pant leg, and raised her arms in the universal gesture of wanting to be picked up. Grady looked down at her. Nobody was watching except two of his Marines, who suddenly found something very interesting on the opposite wall to stare at. He picked her up and put her on his shoulders. She grabbed his ears for balance and made a chirping sound that might have been laughter. Grady carried her like that for the next 20 minutes while he delivered supply crates, and he did not say a word about it afterward. And his Marines did not either, because they liked having teeth. Corporal Tony Vega had turned the largest open space on the Rethani flagship into a medical station. He had portable examination tables, a surgery kit, and more medicine than the Rethani had seen in months. The line of patients stretched down the corridor every morning and did not shrink until late at night. Most of the cases were things that should have been treated long ago. Infections that had been left to worsen, broken bones that had healed crooked, malnutrition so severe that some of the older Rethani could barely stand. Vega treated them all with the same steady patience. He explained everything he was doing through Selah, or through the growing number of Rethani who were picking up basic English words. He trained a group of Rethani volunteers in basic medical care, how to clean wounds, how to set a simple fracture, how to recognize the signs of serious infection. He gave them supplies from the convoy's reserves and told them they were medics now. Some of them cried when he said that. He pretended not to notice. As the days passed, the relationship between the two species began to change. At first, the Rethani had watched the humans with a mixture of gratitude and fear. They were thankful for the help, but the speed and scale of it was overwhelming, and there was always Dren's suspicion whispering in the background. What do they want in return? But the humans did not ask for anything. They worked, they shared their food, they fixed things, and when the work was done for the day, they sat with the Rethani and tried to talk. The language barrier was real, but smaller than anyone expected. Selah translated constantly, and other Rethani began learning human words with surprising speed. Within 3 days, basic conversations were happening without a translator. War Chief Dren watched all of this. He watched the human soldiers carry food to Rethani families. He watched the engineers crawl through damaged ships without complaint. He watched Vega sit on the floor with a sick Rethani child in his lap, feeding her medicine with a small spoon and singing something quiet that the child seemed to like, even though she could not understand the words. Dren went to Sergeant Grady on the evening of the third day. He stood in front of the human soldier and asked a question that had been eating at him. He asked why the human warriors did the work of builders. In Rethani culture, a warrior's purpose was to fight. Warriors did not carry food. They did not weld metal. They did not kneel on the floor with sick children. Grady thought about this for a moment. Then he said that where he came from, a soldier's job was to protect people. Sometimes that meant carrying a rifle. Sometimes it meant carrying a welding torch. Sometimes it meant carrying a little girl on your shoulders because she asked. The job was the same, no matter what tool was in your hand. Dren said it was a strange way of thinking. Grady said it worked for them. Dren almost smiled, and then he walked away. Meanwhile, Commander Holt had been working on something bigger. The convoy carried prefabricated colony modules, structures designed to be dropped onto a planet's surface and assembled into buildings within days. Shelters, water treatment plants, power generators, medical clinics, everything a new settlement would need. Holt had identified a habitable moon orbiting a gas giant in a nearby star system. The moon had breathable air, fresh water, and soil that could grow food. It was just outside the edge of HFY claimed space, far enough away to be defensible. He brought the idea to Elder Vathi in a private meeting. He spread a star chart on the table and pointed to the moon. He said the humans wanted to build the Rathani a home, not a temporary shelter, a real, permanent home, with buildings and infrastructure and room to grow. Vathi stared at the chart. He did not speak for a very long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and his voice was barely a whisper. He asked if Holt was serious. Holt said he was. Vathi placed his hand flat on the star chart, over the image of the little moon, and closed his eyes. He stayed like that for a long time. That evening, two things happened that changed everything. First, Sayla intercepted a coded transmission on a HFY military frequency. She could not decrypt all of it, but she caught enough to understand the meaning. The HFY Dominion knew where the Rathani fleet was. They were sending ships. Second, the sensor contact that Holt had been watching for 3 days finally resolved on the ironclad screens. It was not one ship. It was 12. A full HFY strike force, cruisers, destroyers, and a dreadnought at the center, and they were heading straight for the Rathani fleet. That was how long they had. Holt called a meeting in the Ironclad's war room. Price, Grady, Webb, Tran, and Dren stood around the tactical table. Holt laid out the situation in plain words. He said a HFY fleet was coming. He said the Rathani ships were too slow to outrun them. He said the Ironclad would stay and fight. Price asked about the odds. Holt said 1 battleship against 12 warships was not ideal. Then he said the alternative was leaving the Rathani to die, and that was not going to happen. So the odds did not matter much. Dren, who had spent 3 days watching these humans give everything they had for a people they owed nothing to, straightened his back and said his warriors would fight beside them. Holt looked at the old war chief and nodded. He said he was counting on it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Webb asked how much time they had to prepare. Holt said 48 hours. Webb said she could work with that. And the planning began. The 48 hours before the HFY arrived were the busiest of Danny Holt's life, and he had lived through some very busy days. He started with the civilian ships. Every Rathani vessel was moved into a tight formation directly behind the Ironclad, using the battleship's massive body and shield generators as a wall between them and whatever was coming. The weakest ships went to the center. The ones with functioning engines went to the edges, ready to break away and run if everything fell apart. Dr. Webb and Amy Tran worked without rest to make sure every Rathani ship could move under its own power. If the battle went badly, the refugees needed to be able to run. Tran personally checked the engines of 11 ships in 20 hours. On 3 of them, she rebuilt entire fuel relay systems from spare parts she pulled out of the human transport ships. She stripped those transports to the bone and did not apologize for it. Sergeant Grady armed Dren's warriors. The Rathani did not have modern weapons. The HFY had made sure of that when they destroyed the homeworld. So Grady opened the Ironclad's reserve armory and handed out human rifles, sidearms, and shoulder-launched anti-ship missiles. Then, he spent 12 hours running the Rethani soldiers through a crash course in how to use them. Dren watched his people train alongside the human Marines, and felt something move in his chest that he had not felt since before the war. It was not hope exactly. It was something harder than hope. It was the feeling a man gets when he is done running, and has decided to turn around and face whatever is chasing him. Captain Rick Dunn scrambled his fighter wing, 24 small strike craft that launched from bays along the Ironclad's belly. He positioned them in a screening formation between the fleet and the direction the Kael'vor were coming from. His pilots were young and sharp, and they had been trained in the hardest combat schools Earth had to offer. They were ready. Holt sent a message to Admiral Sloan on Earth, reporting the situation. Sloan's reply came back 40 minutes later, delayed by the vast distance. It said, "Reinforcements are being dispatched. Hold the line, Commander." Holt did the math. The nearest reinforcement fleet was at least 60 hours away. That meant 30 hours of fighting alone, assuming the battle lasted that long. He did not share this detail with anyone, except Price, and she just nodded and said they had better make those 30 hours count. The Kael'vor fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel on schedule. 12 ships, 4 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, 1 support vessel. And at the center, a dreadnought, the biggest ship in the formation, covered in plasma cannons and armored in layered alloy that the Kael'vor were very proud of. The dreadnought hailed the Ironclad immediately. The Kael'vor commander appeared on the screen. He was tall and angular, with gray-green skin and eyes that had no warmth in them at all. He spoke in a voice that was used to giving orders that were obeyed without question. He told Holt that the Rethani were property of the Kael'vor Dominion. He said they were escaped subjects, and that the Dominion had every right under galactic law to reclaim them. He said the humans had no business in this sector, and ordered them to surrender the refugees and withdraw immediately. He said that failure to comply would be considered an act of war against the Dominion. Holt listened to every word without interrupting. When the Kael'vor commander finished, Holt straightened in his chair. He said his name was Commander Danny Holt of the United Earth Fleet. He said the Rethani were under human protection. He said any ship that attempted to harm them would be destroyed. He told the Kael'vor commander that he had one chance to turn his fleet around and leave. The Kael'vor commander laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. He said the humans were a minor species playing a dangerous game. Then he cut the transmission. 30 seconds later, the Kael'vor fleet advanced. They came in a wedge formation, dreadnought at the center, cruisers on the flanks, destroyers sweeping ahead. It was a standard assault pattern, designed to overwhelm a single target with concentrated firepower from multiple angles. The Kael'vor had used it 100 times against 100 weaker species, and it had always worked. This time was different. Holt gave the order to fire. The Ironclad's primary railgun batteries opened up. Each railgun fired a solid tungsten slug, roughly the size of a car, at a speed that was a meaningful percentage of the speed of light. The physics of what happened when one of those slugs hit something were simple and terrible. The first salvo struck a Kael'vor cruiser dead center. The slug went through the forward shields, through the armor, through the ship, and out the other side. The cruiser broke in half. Both halves spun apart and went dark. The Kael'vor fleet had never encountered kinetic weapons like this. Their defensive systems were built to handle plasma fire and energy beams, not solid projectiles moving at impossible speeds. The second salvo hit a destroyer and turned it into a cloud of expanding debris. The Kael'vor ships scattered in confusion, trying to recalculate their approach. Dunn's fighter wings swept in from the flanks. The small, fast human strike craft dove between the larger Kael'vor ships and fired precision missiles at their engine sections and weapon mounts. 2 more destroyers took critical damage in the first 5 minutes. Lieutenant Price ran the ironclad's point defense systems from the tactical station. HFY plasma bolts rained in from every direction as the enemy recovered from the initial shock. Price tracked them all. The ironclad's laser arrays fired in rapid bursts, cutting down incoming fire before it reached the hull. She moved between targeting solutions like a musician playing an instrument, calm and precise while the ship shook around her. But the HFY had numbers, and numbers mattered. 2 cruisers broke away from the main fight and made a hard run toward the Rethani fleet, bypassing the ironclad entirely. Their intent was clear: ignore the battleship and go straight for the helpless civilians. Grady was waiting for them. The Marines had positioned themselves on the outermost Rethani ships with mounted railguns and anti-ship missile launchers. When the 2 HFY cruisers came into range, Grady gave the order, and the space around the refugee fleet lit up with gunfire. Rethani warriors, armed with human weapons they had learned to use just hours ago, fired alongside the Marines. Dren stood at the front of his people and roared commands in his own language, and his warriors answered him. One of the cruisers took 3 direct missile hits and veered off, trailing fire. The other kept coming. It got close enough to fire a plasma barrage at a Rethani transport, before a concentrated volley from Grady's position tore through its bridge section and killed its command crew. The ship drifted, dead and silent. The plasma barrage from that cruiser had hit the Rethani transport hard. Hull breaches opened on 3 decks. The ship began to lose atmosphere. Inside the transport, Amy Tran heard the impact, felt the floor lurch beneath her, and did not hesitate. She grabbed her emergency kit and ran toward the breaches. She found corridors filling with smoke, emergency lights flashing red, and Rethani civilians scrambling for safety. She shouted at them to move to the inner compartments and started sealing blast doors. The reactor alarm went off. The plasma barrage had damaged the coolant system, and the reactor was heading toward a meltdown that would vaporize the ship and everyone on it. Tran fought her way to the engineering section, pried open an access panel, and looked at the mess inside. Coolant lines were shattered. Power conduits were sparking. The temperature readings were climbing fast. She rerouted the coolant flow through a secondary pipe that was not designed for the pressure. Reinforced it with emergency sealant and a piece of hull plating she ripped off the wall with her bare hands, and held it in place while the system stabilized. The temperature readings slowed, then stopped climbing, then started to drop. The reactor held. The ship held. The people on it lived. Back at the center of the battle, the ironclad was taking punishment. A coordinated salvo from the HFY dreadnought and 2 remaining cruisers struck the lower port side. The armor held in some places. In others, it did not. Hull breaches opened across 3 decks. 11 crew members were killed instantly. Fires broke out in the forward compartments, and damage control teams rushed to contain them. Holt felt the ship shudder under him. He heard the casualty reports come in over the internal channel. He gripped the arms of his command chair and made a decision that the HFY would later describe in their own records as insane. He ordered the ironclad to advance, not retreat, not hold position, advance, directly into the center of the remaining HFY formation, at full combat speed. Price looked at him. Grady, listening from his position on the Rethani ship, looked at his comm unit. Dunn, pulling his fighter wing around for another attack run, asked the bridge to confirm the order. Holt confirmed it. The ironclad surged forward. A Titan-class battleship at full acceleration was not something that could be ignored. The HFY ships tried to scatter, but the ironclad was already among them, and at point-blank range, the battleship was devastating. Holt ordered a full broadside. Every weapon on the port side fired at once. Railguns, Missile tubes, laser batteries, all of it. The combined fire hit 2 HFY destroyers and a cruiser, at such close range that their shields barely had time to register the incoming fire before they collapsed. All 3 ships were destroyed in seconds. The HFY dreadnought, its armor cracked and its systems failing, turned and tried to run. Holt pursued. The ironclad fired a concentrated volley at the dreadnought's engines. The slugs punched through the rear armor and tore the propulsion system apart. The dreadnought went dark, drifting and powerless. The remaining HFY ships, 3 battered destroyers with barely enough fight left in them to fire a shot, saw the dreadnought go down and broke. They turned and jumped to faster-than-light travel, running for HFY space as fast as their damaged engines could carry them. The battle was over. The silence that followed was enormous. For several minutes, nobody spoke on any channel. The only sounds were the hum of damaged systems, the hiss of emergency seals, and the distant crackle of fires being put out. Holt sat in his chair and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for hours. He asked for a damage report. The answers came in slowly. The ironclad had taken significant hits. 23 crew members were dead. 41 were wounded. One of the human transport ships had been rammed by a HFY destroyer during the battle and was destroyed, though most of the crew had evacuated in time. But the Rathani fleet was intact. Every single refugee ship had survived. Sayla broadcast the result to the Rathani fleet. She said the battle was over and that the HFY were gone. Then, the comm channels filled with a sound that the humans had never heard before. It was the Rathani keen, a collective harmonic cry that came from deep in the chest and rose through the throat like a song made of grief and gratitude and disbelief all woven together. It came from every ship in the fleet at once. Thousands of voices joined in a sound that vibrated through the hull of every vessel and made the humans stop whatever they were doing and listen. Some of the human crew cried when they heard it. They did not know exactly what it meant, but they understood it in the way that all living things understand the sound of someone who has been saved from the dark. On the bridge of the ironclad, Price walked to Holt's chair. She asked him if he was all right. He looked at her with tired eyes and said he would be, once they got these people somewhere safe. Then he turned back to his console and started planning the next move, because the battle was over. But the work was not. The days after the battle were slow and heavy. There was no celebration. There was too much to do, and too many people to mourn for anyone to feel like cheering. The humans and the Rathani worked side by side in a kind of tired, shared silence, patching hull breaches, putting out the last of the fires, and carrying the wounded to Vega's medical stations. 23 humans had died in the battle. Commander Holt held a memorial service in the ironclad's main hangar bay on the second day. The crew gathered in formation, clean uniforms and straight backs, while Holt read the names of the dead, one by one. He did not rush. He gave each name its full weight, let it sit in the air before moving on to the next. Elder Vathi had asked permission to attend, and Holt had granted it without hesitation. Vathi arrived with a delegation of Rathani elders, walking slowly through the hangar doors, and taking their place at the side of the human formation. They did not speak at first. They just stood and listened. When Holt finished reading the names, Vathi stepped forward and asked if the Rathani might add their own words. Holt nodded. Vathi closed his eyes and began to sing. It was not singing exactly, not the way humans understood it. It was the Rathani morning chant, a deep, resonant harmonic that started low in his chest and rose through his throat in layers. The other Rathani elders joined him, each voice adding a different note, building a sound that filled the hangar like warm water filling a basin. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and old, and it spoke of loss in a language that needed no translation. Several of the human crew wept openly. Sergeant Grady stood with his jaw locked tight and his eyes fixed on the floor. And the only sign that anything was happening inside him was the way his hands, clasped behind his back, were shaking. When the chant ended, the hangar was silent. Vathi opened his eyes and looked at Holt. He said that the 23 who had fallen were now part of the Rathani memory. He said that as long as the Rathani existed, those names would be spoken and those lives would be honored. He said his people had lost everything, but they would never lose this. Holt thanked him. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. On the third day after the battle, War Chief Dren found Sergeant Grady in a corridor on the Rathani flagship. Dren had been looking for him specifically. He stood in front of the human soldier and was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for a man who normally spoke with the force of a closing door. Then he said that he had been wrong about the humans. He said that in his long life, he had learned that strength was always used for taking. The strong took from the weak, and the weak either endured it or died. That was what the Kael'vor had taught him, and every other species he had ever encountered had confirmed the lesson. But the humans had used their strength to shelter. They had bled and died to protect people who could give them nothing in return. Dren said he did not fully understand it, but he respected it more than he had ever respected anything in his life. Grady listened without interrupting. Then he told Dren something he had heard from his father when he was young. He said the measure of a people is not how they treat those who are powerful, but how they treat those who have nothing. Dren was quiet for a long time. Then he said the Rathani would remember that, and that the debt his people owed the humans could never be repaid. Grady shook his head. He said there was no debt. He said this was just what you did when someone needed help. Then, for the first time since Grady had known him, the old war chief smiled. Within a week, the fleet reached the habitable moon that Holt had identified. It was a beautiful world. From orbit, they could see wide blue oceans, green land masses, and white clouds drifting across a sky that looked almost exactly like Earth's. The air was breathable, the water was clean, the soil was rich and dark. It was not the Rathani homeworld, nothing would ever be that. But it was alive, and it was waiting. Dr. Webb took charge of the settlement construction. The prefabricated colony modules were dropped from the transport ships in precise patterns, landing on a broad, flat plain near the coast. Within hours, the assembly teams were working. Walls went up, roofs sealed into place, power generators hummed to life. Water purification units began pulling clean water from a nearby river. Within 2 weeks, the first permanent structures were standing. Housing units, a medical clinic, a community hall, storage buildings, a school. Webb stood in the middle of the growing settlement with her hands on her hips and her datapad tucked under one arm, directing teams with the efficiency of a woman who had been building things her entire life and was very, very good at it. Amy Tran designed the power grid. She worked alongside Rathani engineers who had been watching her work on the fleet ships and now wanted to learn everything she knew. Together they built a hybrid system that combined human generator technology with Rathani energy routing methods. The result was more efficient than either system would have been alone. Tran was pleased with it, which she showed by nodding once and moving on to the water treatment plant. Corporal Vega established the colony's first medical clinic in one of the prefabricated structures. He unpacked equipment, organized supplies, and continued training the Rathani medics he had started working with on the fleet. When it became clear that the clinic needed more hands than the main convoy could spare, Vega volunteered to stay on after the fleet departed. He said the clinic was not ready to run on its own yet, and he was not leaving until it was. Nobody argued with him. The Rathani chose a name for their new home. They called it Vathi's Landing, after their elder. Vathi tried to refuse the honor. He said he had done nothing to deserve it. The Rathani people overruled him, gently but firmly, and the name stayed. News of what had happened traveled across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. 42 species had refused to help the Rathani. Now, those same species learned that a young, relatively unknown civilization from a small world in the Orion Arm had answered the call, fought a HFY battle group, lost people, and built the Rathani a new home from nothing. The reaction was enormous. Several species sent belated offers of assistance, food, building materials, medical supplies. The Rathani accepted them graciously, because they were not a petty people. But nobody forgot who had come first. 3 spacefaring civilizations that had previously ignored humanity filed formal requests for diplomatic relations with Earth, not because of human weapons or technology, but because of what the humans had shown about who they were. The HFY Dominion was furious. They protested through galactic diplomatic channels, claiming that the Rathani were HFY subjects and that Earth had committed an act of war. The other galactic powers, who had been afraid of the HFY for decades, suddenly found it harder to stay quiet when a species half the Dominion's size had proven that standing up to them was possible. Earth's ambassador to the interstellar community responded to the HFY protest with a single statement. It was short and clear, and it was later carved into a stone slab at the entrance of the Rathani Council Hall on Vathi's landing. The statement read, "The Rathani asked for shelter. Humanity answered. Any government, empire, or dominion that takes issue with this is welcome to take it up with us directly." Admiral Sloane's reinforcement fleet arrived 10 days after the battle, carrying additional supplies, construction equipment, and a full diplomatic team. Earth formally recognized the Rathani settlement and offered a mutual defense pact. Elder Vathi signed it in the council hall of the new colony, surrounded by his people, with Commander Holt standing behind him as a witness. The day the ironclad prepared to depart, the entire colony came out to watch. Thousands of Rathani stood on the open plain and looked up at the sky as the battered battleship lifted out of orbit. The ship was scarred and patched and running on reduced power, and it had never looked more like what it was, a shield that had stood between the helpless and the dark and had held. The last 2 scenes of the story played out quietly. The first was on the surface. Elder Vathi stood at the edge of the settlement as the sun was going down. The sky turned orange and pink, and the clouds caught the light and burned with colors that the Rathani had not seen since their homeworld fell. In the distance, Rathani children were running across the grass, chasing each other and laughing. It was the first time in months they had been able to play outside, in open air, without fear. Sayla stood beside him. She watched the children, and then looked at the old man. Vathi said that when she had sent that message to the Terrans, he had expected nothing. He said he had been alive long enough to know that the universe did not answer prayers. Sayla said she had hoped. She said maybe that was enough. Vathi shook his head slowly. He said it was not hope that had saved them. It was the humans. But perhaps, he added quietly, the humans were the kind of species that made hope worth having. They stood together and watched the sunset in silence. The second scene was on the bridge of the ironclad. Danny Holt stood at the forward viewport and looked down at the colony lights glowing on the moon's surface below. They were small and warm, scattered across the dark like seeds that someone had planted in good soil. 2 months ago, those lights did not exist. 2 months ago, the Rathani were dying in broken ships in empty space, and nobody in the galaxy cared. Lieutenant Price stepped up beside him. She looked down at the lights too. Then she said the Rathani had asked her, before the departure, if the humans would come back. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said they would. He said they always would. Price nodded. She did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. Holt gave the order to jump. The ironclad turned away from the little moon with its new lights, and its new people, and its children running on green grass. The engines powered up. The stars stretched into lines. And then the ship was gone, flying back toward a small blue world on the other side of the galaxy, leaving behind a home that had not existed 2 months ago, built by hands that had reached out across the dark, because a stranger had asked for help. Not because it was required. Not because there was something to gain. Because that was what humans did. The Rithani ship was dying. Everyone on board knew it, but nobody said it out loud. The air tasted wrong. The lights flickered every few minutes. The walls groaned like a tired animal. And somewhere deep in the belly of the vessel, a pipe had been leaking for 3 days, and nobody had the parts to fix it. Elder Vathi sat in the council chamber at the center of the ship. He was old, even by Rithani standards. His feathers, once bright blue, had gone pale and gray. His hands shook when he held them still for too long. But his eyes were sharp, and his mind was clear, and right now his mind was telling him that his people were running out of time. The Rithani were not warriors. They were builders, thinkers, singers. Their homeworld had been a place of tall crystal towers and wide-open skies where their kind soared on warm winds and raised their children in peace. The HFY Dominion had come 6 months ago with a fleet of black warships and burned everything. They took the land. They took the resources. They took whoever was too slow to escape and put them in chains. Vathi had led the survivors into space. 47 ships. That was all that was left of an entire civilization. 47 ships packed with families, children, the old, the sick, and barely enough food to last another few weeks. They had sent distress calls to every spacefaring species they knew. 42 messages sent out into the dark, begging for help, for shelter, for anything at all. The answers came back one by one, and every single one said the same thing. No, we cannot help. The HFY are too dangerous. We are sorry. Some species did not even bother to say sorry. They just said no. Vathi had listened to each refusal with a heavy heart, and now there were no more names on the list. No more options, except one. Sayla was young. She was barely old enough to sit at a comm station, but the Rithani did not have the luxury of waiting for experience anymore. Half the trained officers were dead. The other half were trying to keep the fleet from falling apart. So Sayla sat at the long-range communications panel and did her best, and her best was actually quite good. She had been going through the old star charts, the ones from before the war, looking for anyone the council might have missed. Most of the entries were species the Rithani had already contacted. But deep in the records, buried under decades of forgotten data, she found an entry for a species called Terrans. Homeworld designation: Earth. Location: Orion Arm. Status: young spacefaring civilization, limited contact, no formal diplomatic relations. Sayla brought this to the council. War Chief Dren, who stood against the far wall with his arms crossed, made a sound of disgust. Dren was tall and scarred and angry most of the time. He had lost his mate and 2 of his children when the homeworld fell, and the grief had turned into a cold, hard thing inside him that looked a lot like rage. He told Vathi that the Terrans were nobodies, a small species on a small world with a small fleet. He said reaching out to them was a waste of the little power they had left in their communication systems. He said they should save that power for a real chance at survival, though he did not say what that chance might be, because there was none left. Vathi listened. Then he looked at Sayla and told her to send the message. Dren stared at him. Vathi said that when a man is drowning, he does not refuse a hand because it is small. Dren said nothing and walked out of the room. Sayla composed the message. She kept it simple, because their power reserves were low, and she could not afford a long transmission. The message said, We are the Rethani. Our world is gone. Our children are dying. We ask only for shelter. She sent it into the dark and did not expect an answer. The signal traveled a very long way. It crossed empty space, past dead stars, bounced off a relay satellite that a human mining company had placed near the edge of explored territory, and eventually found its way into the communications network of the United Earth Fleet. It landed on the desk of Admiral Peggy Sloan at Fleet Command on Earth. Sloan was a woman in her 60s, with short gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from something hard. She had commanded warships for 30 years. She had fought pirates, put down rebellions, and stared across negotiating tables at people who wanted to kill her. Very little surprised her anymore. But the Rethani message made her stop what she was doing and read it twice. She pulled up everything Earth had on the Kael'vor Dominion. It was not much, but it was enough. A predatory empire. Conquerors. Slavers. They picked on civilizations weaker than themselves and stripped them bare. The intelligence reports said most species in the galaxy were afraid of them, and that nobody stood up to them because the cost was too high. Sloan sat back in her chair and thought about this for a long time. Then she made a call. She did not call the diplomatic corps. She did not call the Foreign Affairs Office. She called the commander of the nearest Titan-class battleship and told him to prepare for immediate deployment. Commander Danny Holt was refueling the USS Ironclad near Jupiter when the orders came through. He was a quiet man in his 40s, with brown hair going gray at the sides, and a calm way of speaking that made people trust him. He read the orders, looked at the attached Rethani distress signal, and read the orders again. Then he stood up, pressed the button for the ship-wide channel, and spoke to every man and woman on the Ironclad. He told them that somewhere far away, a people they had never met were drifting in broken ships with nowhere to go. He told them that 42 species had already said no. He told them that Earth was going to say yes. Not halfway, not maybe, yes. He told them the Ironclad was going, and it was bringing everything. Marines, engineers, food, medicine, building materials, and enough firepower to make sure nobody interfered with the delivery. Within 2 hours, the Ironclad broke orbit and jumped to faster-than-light travel. Behind it, 3 heavy transport ships followed, loaded to their limits with supplies. Back on the Rethani flagship, Sayla had almost forgotten about the message she had sent. It had been 6 hours, and 6 hours of silence was just another kind of no. She was about to shut down her console and try to sleep, when the panel lit up with an incoming signal. She opened it. Her hands were shaking, though she did not know why. The message read, "Rethani vessel, this is the USS Ironclad, United Earth Fleet. Hold your position. We are en route with combat, engineering, and humanitarian support. Estimated arrival, 31 hours. You are not alone anymore." Sayla read the message 3 times. Then she stood up and walked to the council chamber on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. She found Elder Vathi sitting where he always sat, looking tired and old and out of options. She translated the message for him, word by word, and watched his face change. The other council members stared. Dren, who had come back to the chamber, stood frozen against the wall. Vathi lowered his head. A sound came out of him that was small and broken, and full of something that the Rethani had not felt in a very long time. It was hope. Sayla put her hand on the old man's shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Somewhere out in the dark, a ship full of strangers was coming, and for the first time in 6 months, the dying felt like it might stop.